You know, creating passive income can be as easy as simply investing in a nice, diversified ETF like the ones my friend Omar wants to know about. He asked, Ryan, what ETFs do you think are good, like DGRO, VYM, VTI, SCHD? That's an awesome question. We'll be talking about that today, and I'll share 5 of my favorites with you that you can invest in right now to really add some diversification to your portfolio, as well as some dividend income. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, my friends, what is going on? It's so great to see you guys. My name is Ryan Williams, and here I talk about how to create passive income and reach financial freedom by investing in dividend stocks. Today, we're going to be talking about these things called ETFs, which is an acronym that stands for Exchange Traded Fund. And essentially, an ETF is something that you can invest in just like you would any other normal stock, but instead of just buying one individual company like Microsoft or Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble, ETFs allow you to buy a big basket of stocks all at once. So just from investing in one ETF, you could actually be investing in hundreds or even thousands of different companies, which adds a whole lot of diversification to your portfolio, and I think is a great place to start if you are new to the stock market. Anyway, guys, let's just go on ahead and get into the top 5 dividend ETFs, starting with VIG, which is the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF. And VIG, guys, is the OG dividend ETF. It is the oldest ETF out of all the different ones we're talking about today, and it first came onto the market April 21st, 2006. And one of the things about ETFs, guys, is they typically track a certain stock index like the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ or the Dow Jones. VIG in particular tracks what is called the S&P US Dividend Growers Index, which is designed to measure the performance of companies here in the United States that have followed a policy of consistently increasing their dividends every year for at least 10 consecutive years. So every stock that is held within the VIG ETF has a dividend growth history of at least 10 consecutive years, which is sweet. And a lot of these companies are ones that you're going to be familiar with, starting with Apple at the top there, which is this ETF's biggest holding, coming in at 4.09% of the overall allocation. We have some Johnson & Johnson, some JP Morgan, some Procter & Gamble, Visa, Home Depot. So really, guys, this is a pretty well diversified ETF and gets you exposure to a ton of different companies and a ton of different sectors, and kind of is like its own little portfolio all in one. And as far as the returns you can expect from this ETF, guys, it's not too bad. Since its inception in 2006, it has an average annual return of nearly 10%. And then in the last 10 years, since 2012, it's a little bit higher. It does about 13% per year on average. And having said that, if you were to have invested $10,000 into VIG 10 years ago, back in March of 2012, today you would have nearly $34,000. So you will have more than tripled your money in the last 10 years from investing into this ETF, which is pretty sweet. And some of that is coming from dividends being reinvested as well, which brings us to the next point, getting into some of the dividend stats for this ETF. You guys will see the starting yield is nothing too crazy, 1.78%, which for those of you who don't know how to break that down, basically this means for every $1,000 you have invested into this ETF, you'll receive $17.80 per year in dividends. The 5-year growth rate is pretty respectable, 9.06%, so you're getting some good dividend growth as the years go on. Now, one other thing to note about ETFs, guys, is that because they're managed by a team of people who are making tweaks, rearranging some of the positions, making sure the ETF is performing as it should, there are some costs involved, which we call the expense ratio. VIG's, for example, is 0.06%, which means that for every $1,000 you have invested in this ETF, you're only paying like 60 cents per year in expenses. Nothing crazy. And there are some other dividend ETFs out there like SCHD, for example, that have much higher expense ratios at like, 0.3%, which means you're paying 5 times the fees that you would with VIG. Just something to keep in mind as you're shopping around for different ETFs. Now, moving on, getting into the next ETF, guys, this one is VYM, the Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF, which also has been around the block for some time and came onto the market on November 10th, 2006, which is just a few months after VIG. Now, instead of tracking companies that have grown their dividends for a certain period of time like VIG, VYM more so targets companies that have a high forward dividend yield. So the difference between these two ETFs is basically dividend yield versus dividend growth, which will make more sense in just a moment when we talk about the dividend stats. But before we get to that, taking a look at this ETF's top 10 holdings, we're going to see some crossover between this one and VYM. As you guys can see, there's some similar companies between the two in the top 10 holdings. Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan, Procter & Gamble, and Broadcom down there are top 10s in both of these ETFs. But we're seeing some differences here as well. We see ExxonMobil in the top 10 holdings of this one, as well as Chevron, Pfizer, AbbVie. So they're not 100% the same, and even more so, we can see that the performance between these two is quite a bit different. Since VYM came onto the market in 2006, it has generated an average annual return of 8.71%, which is basically 1% lower on average than what we saw with VIG. And as far as what you would get if you invested $10,000 into this ETF 10 years ago, that would turn into $31,653.39, which really is not too shabby. You're still, more than 3xing your money, but you would have made a couple grand more overall if you would have invested in VIG around the same time. Now, getting into the dividend stats, you guys can see that the starting yield on this one is 2.43%, which is considerably higher than what we saw with VIG. And the 5-year growth rate is not too bad as well. It's not as high as the last ETF, but 7% I think is still pretty sweet, so I'll take that. And looking at the dividend history chart right here, we're seeing a pretty nice increase in the dividend as time goes on. And the expense ratio here is the same as well, still 0.06%. So like I said, a very affordable ETF to own. All right, moving on to the third stock of the day, we have HDV, which is the iShares Core High Dividend ETF, which came onto the market March 29th, 2011, just a few years after VYM, both of which are high dividend yield ETFs. Now, obviously, we can see in the name of both of these ETFs that they both target high yield dividend stocks, but there are some differences, some pretty clear differences between these two, starting with the top 10 holdings. And it's not so much that the companies themselves are too different. I mean, we still see Exxon in both of these. We see Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan, Chevron, but the allocations are much different. For example, in HDV there on the left, ExxonMobil is the biggest holding, making up 7.4% of the ETF's allocation, whereas ExxonMobil is only 2.35% of VYM. We'll see a similar trend here in AbbVie, JP Morgan, Johnson & Johnson, and Chevron, pretty much all the way down. The allocation of the holdings are just different all across the board, as are the number of holdings. HDV has 81 total holdings in the ETF compared to VYM's 448, so quite a big difference there. And we're seeing a difference in the returns with this ETF as well. Since its inception in 2011, it's generated an average year-over-year return of 10.87%, which is a bit higher than what we saw with both VYM and VIG. But remember, those ETFs have been around for 5 years before this one came around. And those ETFs also had to go through the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009. So that is definitely something that contributes to the lower overall performance. Now, if you were to have invested $10,000 into HDV about 10 years ago, today you would have $30,687.35, which is the lowest number we've seen all day from the 3 ETFs we've covered so far. And moving on to the dividend stats, guys, this one has the highest starting yield at 2.92% and a 5-year growth rate that's pretty average. It's the lowest we've seen all day, 4.34%. So make of that what you will. The dividend growth history chart looking right here, we're still seeing it trend upward. So we're still seeing increased dividend payments over time, which is good. And also one other thing with this ETF, as far as the expense ratio goes, it is a little bit higher than the other two, 0.08% compared to 0.06% from the other two. So a little bit more expensive. All right, guys, moving on to the fourth ETF of the day. This one is SCHD, the Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF. It is a fan favorite amongst dividend ETF investors. It's a staple for many people's portfolios, and it's also one that I have in my own portfolio. If you saw my last video, you'll know that I just bought into SCHD in my Roth IRA on M1 Finance, so I'm stoked to be a part of the SCHD gang. Now, SCHD tracks what is called the Dow Jones US Dividend 100 Index, which targets high dividend yielding stocks here in the United States with a record of consistently paying their dividends out to shareholders. So strong record of paying their dividends, strong, reliable companies like some of the ones here in the top 10 holdings like Texas Instruments, Pepsi, Pfizer, Merck. All in all, SCHD has 104 different holdings, so it is still pretty diverse. And as far as SCHD's performance, it has averaged an annual return of over 15% since its inception 10 years ago, back in 2011, 11 years ago, excuse me. So it's done pretty well across the last 10, 11 years, better than what we've seen from the rest of the ETFs so far today. And if you were to have invested $10,000 into SCHD, SCHD back 10 years ago, you would have a whopping $38,250 today, which is the highest amount of returns we've seen all day. Now, moving on, getting into the dividend stats, SCHD has a forward dividend yield of 2.7%. So right in line with what we saw with HDV as well as VYM, and SCHD has, look at that growth rate, guys, nearly 12%, a whopping double-digit 5-year growth rate. So that dividend is really taken off, and they have been growing the dividend for 4 consecutive years, the longest growth history we've seen out of all of the different ETFs today. And the last thing worth mentioning about SCHD is the expense ratio, which is sitting at 0.06%. So very cheap, very low expenses. That's what we like to see. All right, guys, now getting into the fifth and final ETF of the day. This one is DGRO, which is one of the ones my friend Omar asked about in the intro to this video. DGRO is the iShares Core Dividend Growth ETF, which is probably going to be more symmetrical to VIG, which is the Dividend Appreciation ETF we talked about earlier in the video, right? And DGRO is the new kid on the block. They came onto the market back on June 10th, 2014, so they've been around for less than 10 years. Now, getting into the top 10 holdings of DGRO, we see some very awesome companies like Microsoft, Apple, Johnson & Johnson, look pretty familiar, right? Pfizer, JP Morgan, Procter & Gamble. Guys, it's almost like we're looking at the same ETF over and over and over again, right? And all in all, guys, DGRO has 421 different companies within the ETF, so it's very, very, very diverse, and actually has not been performing too terrible since its inception. Since then, it has averaged an annual return of 12.82%, which is not too shabby, although not as high as we've seen from some of the other ETFs today. And if you were to have invested $10,000 into this ETF back when it first came onto the market in 2014, today you would have $24,602.84. Now, as far as the DGRO dividend goes, it has a forward yield of 2.05%, not the highest, but also not the lowest we've seen all day, with a 5-year growth rate that is also looking really good, 10.2%. And take a look at this dividend growth history chart right here. We're seeing those dividend payments increase as the years go on, pretty much every year straight since its inception, it looks like. Now, moving on, the last thing we'll mention with DGRO is the expense ratio, which is sitting at 0.08%. I wouldn't sweat that too much. That, for me, it's not a deal breaker, I'll tell you that. Moving on, those were the 5 dividend ETFs I wanted to talk about today: VIG, VYM, HDV, SCHD, and DGRO. And I'm curious, out of all of the ones we talked about today, which one, if you had to choose one, are you most likely to invest in? Would you go with VYM, the high dividend yield ETF, or SCHD, the fan favorite, or maybe DGRO, the new kid on the block? Which one are you most likely to invest in? Leave a comment below and let me know. And with that said, if you want to keep talking dividend stocks with me, then let's keep the party going. Click on this video right up over here, guys. And if you want to see more videos like this from me in the future, then hit the subscribe button as well. And with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Hope you all have a great day, and I will see you in the next one.